They called them chocolate soldiers. The generals laughed at them. The professionals refused to fight beside them. And Australia's own commander-in-chief stood before them after the battle and called them cowards. To their faces. But here is what nobody told you. Those so-called untrained boys held a jungle ridge for 3 days against 5,000 battle-hardened Japanese veterans. They fought with rusty rifles, empty stomachs, and boots that were falling apart. They stopped an invasion force that had already conquered half of Asia, and they did it while the men who mocked them watched, in stunned silence. This is the story the Australian military establishment tried to bury. The story of teenage conscripts who were sent into the worst terrain on earth with no supplies, no support, and no hope of reinforcement, and who refused to break. One of them charged a machine gun nest alone and changed the course of an entire battle. Another held a weapon pit for an entire day with his bare hands. And their commanding general? He got a knighthood. They got wooden crosses. If you think you know the Kokoda story, think again. Because what happened at Isurava in August of 1942 is darker, bloodier, and more outrageous than anything you have ever been told. Stay with me until the end, because the final detail of this story is the one that will hit you hardest. 26th of August, 1942. A wall of green jungle, a ridge so narrow that 3 men cannot walk abreast. And somewhere in that dripping, rotting darkness, roughly 5,000 battle-hardened Japanese soldiers are pushing south with one single objective: Port Moresby, the last doorstep before the Australian mainland. Standing between that force and the fall of an entire continent is a collection of roughly 400 filthy, half-starved, trembling teenagers who have never fired a shot in anger. They are militiamen, conscripts. The regular army calls them Chocos, chocolate soldiers, because everyone expects them to melt the moment the heat is on. Within 72 hours, those same Chocos will fight one of the most savage close-quarters engagements of the entire Pacific War. They will hold a position that seasoned veterans considered indefensible. They will buy time that no British staff officer, no American general, and certainly no desk-bound politician in Canberra ever thought they could buy. And when it is over, the men who mock them will never use the word Choco again, at least not without lowering their eyes first. This is the Battle of Isurava, and it is the story Australia almost forgot. To understand what happened on that ridge, you have to rewind to the opening months of 1942, when the strategic picture for Australia was not merely grim, it was catastrophic. Singapore had fallen in February. 15,000 Australian prisoners of war were marching into the camps of Changi and the Thai-Burma Railway. The supposedly impregnable fortress had crumbled in a week, and with it, the comfortable myth that Mother Britain would always protect her colonies. The Japanese Imperial Navy was roaming the Pacific almost unopposed. Darwin had been bombed. More ordnance dropped on that single raid than on Pearl Harbor. Japanese midget submarines had entered Sydney Harbor. The public was gripped by an invasion panic that, for once in the history of wartime hysteria, was not entirely irrational. But the real threat was not coming from the sea. It was coming overland, through a place most Australians had never heard of and could not find on a map, the Owen Stanley Range of Papua New Guinea, the Kokoda Track, a ribbon of mud, root, and vertical rock stretching roughly 96 kilometers through some of the most punishing terrain on the planet. Altitudes above 2,000 meters. Rainfall so heavy that a man could drown standing up. Tropical ulcers that ate through flesh to the bone. Malaria, scrub typhus, dysentery, and the Japanese Nankai Shitai. The South Seas Force under Major General Tomitaro Hori was already on that track, moving fast and moving south. But here is where the story turns from bad to outrageous. The men sent to stop this juggernaut were not the battle-hardened veterans of the 6th, 7th, or 9th Divisions. The legendary Rats of Tobruk, the men who had fought Rommel across North Africa and earned the grudging respect of the Wehrmacht. Those troops were either still in the Middle East, fighting in the Western Desert, or were being shipped home on transports that would not arrive for weeks. The men sent to Papua were the 39th Battalion, Australian Military Forces, militia, part-timers, weekend warriors. Most of them were between 18 and 20 years old. Some had lied about their age and were younger still. Their average training period before deployment was roughly 3 months, much of it spent on parade grounds in Victoria, learning drill movements that were about as useful in the jungle as a silk umbrella in a cyclone. They had been issued with First World War-era equipment. Their rifles were Lee Enfields that had seen service at Gallipoli, literally the same weapons their grandfathers had carried. Their boots were designed for the Flanders mud, not the vertical jungle. Many had no mosquito nets, no waterproof capes, no rations beyond what they could carry on their backs. Their maps were almost comically inaccurate, drawn from aerial surveys that could not penetrate the jungle canopy, and their officers, with a few notable exceptions, were as green as the men they led. The Chocos had not volunteered for overseas service. Under Australian law at the time, militia could only be deployed within Australian territory. Papua, as an administered territory, technically qualified, a legal loophole that allowed the government to send these boys north without asking the inconvenient question of whether they actually wanted to go. The Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, the volunteers, the regulars, looked down on the militia with a contempt that was open, vocal, and vicious. The AIF men had a saying. CMF stood for Chocolate Military Forces, or, in the cruder version, something far less printable. The implication was clear. These boys were not real soldiers. They were fillers, speed bumps, the warm bodies you threw into a gap while the professionals got ready. And that contempt was not limited to barracks gossip. It went all the way to the top. General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, had already written off Papua New Guinea as a sideshow. His grand strategy focused on the Philippines, on island hopping with the United States Marine Corps. The defense of the Kokoda track was, in his view, a holding action at best. He wanted the Australians to slow the Japanese, nothing more. And the man he put in charge of the Australian forces, General Sir Thomas Blamey, shared that assessment with a particular twist of cruelty. Blamey would later stand before the survivors of Kokoda and accuse them, to their faces, of being cowards who had been running from the enemy. The men who had carried their wounded mates down vertical cliffs, who had fought hand-to-hand in the dark with bayonets and bare fists, who had lost half their number to enemy fire and the other half to disease. Those men were told by their own commanding general that they had disgraced the uniform. But that insult was still weeks away. In late July of 1942, the 39th Battalion was trudging north along the Kokoda track, and they were about to walk into a nightmare that no amount of parade ground training could have prepared them for. The first contact came at Kokoda village itself, on the 28th of July. A forward platoon under Lieutenant Colonel William Owen was dug in around the small airstrip when Japanese scouts appeared at the perimeter. Owen had roughly 77 men. The Japanese had several hundred, with more pouring in behind them. The fighting was brief, chaotic, and brutal. Owen took a round during the engagement and was carried off the field. He would not survive. The 39th pulled back. It was not a rout. It was an organized withdrawal in the face of overwhelming numbers. But the word that filtered back to headquarters in Port Moresby, and from there to Brisbane and Canberra, was that the militia had retreated. And in the lexicon of the Australian military establishment, retreat and cowardice were the same word. Nobody mentioned that 77 men had held off several hundred. Nobody mentioned that they had inflicted casualties. Nobody mentioned that the terrain made reinforcement impossible and resupply a fantasy. The narrative was already being written, and it was a narrative of failure. But the worst was yet to come. Far worse. Through the first 3 weeks of August, the 39th Battalion fought a series of desperate rearguard actions along the track, at Diniki, at Isurava, at Eora Creek. Each engagement followed the same grim pattern. A tiny force of Australians would dig in on a ridge or a creek crossing. The Japanese would probe, find the flanks, and attempt to encircle. The Australians would hold for as long as ammunition lasted, then pull back to the next defensible position. They were trading space for time, and they were paying for that time in blood. The conditions were beyond anything the training manuals described. The track itself was not a track at all in any recognizable sense. It was a series of near-vertical ascents and descents, slippery with red clay that turned to grease in the rain. Men carrying wounded on stretchers needed 8 bearers working in shifts, and the carry from the front line to the nearest aid post could take 12 hours. The stretcher bearers were local Papuans, the legendary Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, and without them, every casualty would have been left where he fell. Food was running out. The standard ration was a tin of bully beef and a handful of rice per day, when it arrived at all. Airdrops were attempted, but the jungle canopy was so dense that most of the supplies fell into ravines or into Japanese-held territory. The men were losing weight at a terrifying rate. Some would shed up to 25 kilograms during the campaign. Malaria was rampant. Dysentery turned strong young men into shaking wrecks who could barely stand, let alone fight. And there was no evacuation. If you were too sick to walk, your mates carried you. If your mates were too sick to carry you, you crawled. Into this catastrophe walked one man who would change everything, and his name was Ralph Honor. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor was not a militiaman. He was AIF to his bones, a veteran of the campaigns in Libya, Greece, and Crete. He had led men in some of the hardest fighting of the North African theater. He was tough, experienced, and absolutely no nonsense. And when he arrived at Isurava in mid-August to take command of the 39th Battalion, what he found nearly broke his heart. He later described the men as looking like the walking remains of some terrible disaster. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, shivering with fever, their uniforms rotted to rags, their boots falling apart. Many had the 1,000-yard stare of men who had been in continuous combat for weeks without relief. Their numbers had been gutted. The battalion that had started with over 600 men was down to fewer than 300 effectives, and of those, almost everyone was carrying some wound, illness, or both. They looked, in Honor's unsparing assessment, like scarecrows. But here is the thing that Ralph Honor noticed, and that the generals in their air-conditioned offices in Brisbane did not. These scarecrows were still fighting. They had not broken. They had not surrendered. They had not thrown down their weapons and fled into the jungle, which would have been the easiest and most understandable thing in the world. They were still on the track, still holding their positions, still firing back. They were doing it badly by the book standards of a staff college. Their fieldcraft was rough. Their fire discipline was patchy. Their communications were almost non-existent. But they were doing it, and the fact that they were doing it at all, given what they had been through and what they had been given to do it with, was nothing short of extraordinary. Honor did not tell them they were heroes. That was not his style, and it was not the Australian way. He told them to dig deeper, clean their weapons, and prepare for what was coming. Because what was coming was the full weight of Hori's Nankai Shitai, and it was coming straight at Isurava. But the Chocos were not going to face it alone. Not this time. The 2nd 14th Battalion and the 2nd 16th Battalion of the AIF, 7th Division veterans, men who had fought in Syria and the Middle East, were being rushed up the track from Port Moresby. These were the professionals, the elite, the men with the desert tan and the confident swagger of soldiers who had already beaten one enemy and expected to beat another. And when they arrived at Isurava, they looked at the Chocos with something between pity and contempt. One AIF sergeant reportedly glanced at the militia positions and muttered that he had seen better fieldworks at a Boy Scout camp. That contempt would not survive the next 72 hours. The Battle of Isurava began in earnest on the 26th of August, 1942, and it began with a Japanese assault of ferocity that even the AIF veterans had not anticipated. Hori had brought up his best troops, the 144th Regiment and the 41st Regiment, plus mountain artillery, heavy machine guns, and mortars. The Japanese had been fighting in China and Malaya. They were jungle warfare specialists. They were well-fed, well-supplied, and supremely confident after an unbroken string of victories that stretched from Pearl Harbor to the fall of Rabaul. The Australian position at Isurava was a series of shallow weapon pits scraped into a ridgeline overlooking a small clearing. The perimeter was roughly shaped like a horseshoe, with the open end facing north, the direction from which the Japanese would come. Fields of fire were measured in meters, not hundreds of meters. The jungle was so thick that a man could be standing 5 paces away and be invisible. This was not the open desert of North Africa, where you could see a panzer at 2 kilometers. This was fighting at the range of a thrown grenade. The Japanese attacked in waves, probing for weak points, using their mortars to soften the perimeter, then sending infantry forward in rushes. The noise was indescribable. The crack of Arisaka rifles, the chatter of Nambu machine guns, the hollow thud of mortar bombs, and over all of it, the screaming of men in two languages. The Australians fired back with everything they had: Lee Enfields, Bren guns, Thompson submachine guns, grenades. The jungle floor became a carpet of spent brass and torn vegetation. And here is where the Chocos proved every single one of their critics catastrophically wrong. The 39th Battalion, those half-trained, half-starved, fever-ridden teenagers, held their section of the perimeter against repeated Japanese assaults. They did not break, they did not waver. When the Japanese penetrated a section of the line, the Chocos counterattacked with bayonets, a weapon most of them had only practiced with on straw dummies back in Victoria. When their ammunition ran low, they scavenged rounds from the fallen. When their Bren guns jammed from the mud and humidity, they cleared them and kept firing. When the Japanese tried to outflank them through the jungle, the Chocos adjusted their positions and refused to give ground. They did all of this while standing shoulder to shoulder with the AIF, the very men who had sneered at them days before. And those AIF men, to their credit, stopped sneering very quickly indeed. Because the 39th was not just holding the line. They were holding the hardest part of the line, the section that faced the steepest approach and the most determined Japanese attacks. And they were doing it not because they were ordered to, not because they were afraid of punishment, but because the blokes on either side of them were their mates, and you do not leave your mates. But the Japanese kept coming. That was the horror of it. They simply kept coming. On the 27th of August, the second day of the battle, the Japanese launched their heaviest assault yet. They had brought up reinforcements during the night, dragging supplies and ammunition up the same hideous track that had nearly destroyed the Australians. The attack came from three directions simultaneously: north, east, and west. The Australian perimeter began to buckle. Positions that had held on the first day were overrun. Small groups of Australians found themselves cut off, fighting in isolated pockets with no communication and no way to know if the men on their flanks were still alive. It was during this chaos that one of the most remarkable acts of individual courage in Australian military history took place. Private Bruce Steele Kingsbury of the 2nd 14th Battalion was in a reserve position behind the main perimeter when he saw what was happening. A Japanese force had broken through the line and was pouring into the Australian rear. If they were not stopped in the next few minutes, the entire position would be rolled up from behind, and every man on the ridge would be trapped. Kingsbury grabbed a Bren gun from a wounded mate, charged forward into the breach, and opened fire from the hip. He ran directly at the oncoming Japanese, spraying rounds into their ranks at point-blank range. The sheer shock of a single man charging into their assault broke the momentum of the Japanese advance. They faltered, then fell back. Kingsbury had plugged the gap single-handedly. Moments later, a Japanese sniper put a round through him, and Bruce Kingsbury fell in the mud of Isurava. He was 24 years old. He would be awarded the Victoria Cross, the first to be won on Australian soil, given Papua's status as an administered territory. But Bruce Kingsbury did not charge for a medal. He charged because the line was broken and his mates were going to be cut off, and that was a thing that could not be allowed to happen. And Kingsbury was not alone. The ridge at Isurava produced acts of desperate courage that would have been dismissed as fiction if they had appeared in a Hollywood script. Corporal Charlie McCallum of the 2nd 14th held a forward weapon pit for almost an entire day, refusing to withdraw despite being wounded multiple times. When the Japanese finally rushed his position, McCallum fought them off with grenades until he had none left, then with his rifle, then with his bare hands. He was eventually pulled out by his mates, more carried than walking, and he would receive the Distinguished Conduct Medal. But it was the Chocos around him, unnamed, undecorated, unknown, who had kept the positions on either side of him intact and prevented the Japanese from simply bypassing his pit. The fighting on the 28th of August was the worst of all. The Japanese had numerical superiority of roughly 5 or 6 to 1. They had more ammunition, more machine guns, more mortars, and fresher troops. The Australians were running on empty, physically, emotionally, logistically. Water was scarce. The wounded could not be evacuated fast enough. The aid post behind the lines was overflowing, and the medical officer was operating with supplies that would have disgraced a country veterinary clinic. And still they held. For a third day, the combined force of the 39th, the 2nd 14th, and the 2nd 16th held that ridgeline against the best jungle fighters in the world. They held it not with superior firepower, not with air support. There was no air support. Not with armor, not with any of the technological advantages that the Americans would later bring to the Pacific. They held it with bolt-action rifles, Bren guns, bayonets, and a quality that no training manual has ever been able to define or replicate, the absolute bone-deep refusal to let the blokes beside them down. But the mathematics of war are merciless, and by the 29th of August, those mathematics had become impossible to argue with. The Japanese had committed over 3,000 troops to the assault on Isurava, with more arriving every hour. The Australians had lost a third of their effective strength in 3 days. Ammunition stocks were critical. The perimeter had been penetrated in multiple places, and counterattacks had become smaller and less effective each time. Ralph Honor made the decision to withdraw, not in panic, not in disorder, but in a controlled fighting retreat that would allow the force to fall back to the next defensible position at Yora Creek. The withdrawal from Isurava was a masterclass in rearguard tactics, conducted by men who were barely standing. Small groups held choke points on the track while the main body moved south. The Japanese pursued aggressively but cautiously. They had learned at terrible cost that Australian rearguards were not to be rushed. Every bend in the track, every fallen log, every creek crossing might conceal a Bren gun and a man who had nothing left to lose. And here is where the true cost of Isurava must be reckoned. The 39th Battalion, which had entered the Kokoda campaign with over 600 men, was effectively finished as a fighting unit. Fewer than 60 men were still fit for duty. The rest were gone, casualties of battle, disease, or complete physical collapse. The 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th had also taken severe losses. The Japanese had taken even heavier casualties in absolute terms. Hori's force had lost several hundred at Isurava alone, and their supply line was now stretched to breaking point. But the numbers do not tell the real story. The real story is what those 3 days bought. 3 days does not sound like much. In the context of a world war that lasted 6 years, it is an eye blink. But those 3 days at Isurava, purchased with the blood and guts and sheer stubborn fury of Chocos and AIF men fighting side by side, were 3 days that the Japanese could not afford. Every day the Nankai Shitai spent fighting at Isurava was a day they were not advancing toward Port Moresby. Every bullet they fired was a bullet that could not be replaced, because their own supply line over the Owen Stanley Range was every bit as fragile as the Australian one. Every man they lost was a man who could not be reinforced, because the Imperial Japanese Navy was now fully committed at Guadalcanal and could not spare the shipping. Those 3 days allowed the 7th Division to concentrate its forces. Those 3 days gave the engineers time to improve the airdrop zones. Those 3 days gave MacArthur's headquarters the breathing space to realize that Kokoda was not a sideshow. It was the main event. And those 3 days proved something that would resonate through every subsequent engagement of the New Guinea campaign, that the Japanese soldier, for all his discipline and ferocity and willingness to perish for the emperor, could be stopped, could be fought to a standstill, could be beaten, and the men who proved it first were not the AIF. They were the Chocos. But the Australian military establishment did not see it that way. Not at first. And what happened next is one of the most disgraceful episodes in Australian military history. General Thomas Blamey, the Commander-in-Chief of the Australian military forces, flew to Port Moresby in October of 1942 to address the troops returning from Kokoda. What he said to them has never been forgiven. He stood before the survivors, the men with the hollow eyes and the jungle sores and the shaking hands, and he told them that the Kokoda campaign had been marked by retreats and failures. He implied, without quite saying outright, that the troops had run from the enemy. He used language that every man present understood as an accusation of cowardice. The reaction was volcanic. Men who had barely survived the track, who had watched their mates fall beside them, who had carried the wounded on their backs through mud and rain and enemy fire for weeks, were being told by a general who had never set foot on the Kokoda track that they had let the country down. Ralph Honor was so furious that he confronted Blamey directly, in front of witnesses, and told him that the 39th Battalion deserved praise, not condemnation. Other officers were equally outraged, but the chain of command being what it was, most could do little more than seethe. The irony was thick enough to cut with a bayonet. The men who had actually fought the Japanese, who had seen the enemy at arm's length, who had smelled his breath and felt his bayonet and heard his screams, were being lectured on courage by men who had seen the war from behind desks in Brisbane. But Blamey's insult, appalling as it was merely the most public expression of a deeper prejudice that ran through the entire command structure. MacArthur was equally dismissive. His intelligence staff had consistently underestimated the Japanese force on the Kokoda track, and when the militia had been forced to withdraw in the face of overwhelming numbers, MacArthur had blamed the soldiers rather than his own faulty intelligence. He had sent messages to Washington suggesting that Australian troops were unreliable and that American forces should be given a larger role in the defense of Papua. The fact that his own intelligence had told him there were perhaps 1,000 Japanese on the track, when the actual number was closer to 6,000, was conveniently omitted from those reports. And the Australian press, taking its cue from the generals, initially treated the Kokoda campaign as a story of failure. The word retreat appeared in headlines. The militia were portrayed as boys who had been sent to do a man's job and had found it beyond them. The Chocos, in the public imagination, were still chocolate soldiers. But that narrative could not survive the truth. And the truth, slowly, relentlessly, emerged. It emerged in the letters that survived. The quiet, understated accounts of men who wrote home about what they had seen and done. It emerged in the after-action reports that told a different story from the one the generals were peddling. It emerged in the testimony of the AIF veterans who had fought alongside the 39th and who, to a man, refused to accept that the militia had been anything less than magnificent. One AIF veteran of the 2nd 14th put it in terms that could not be misunderstood. He said that when he arrived at Isurava and saw the Chocos, he expected to find a rabble. Instead, he found men who had been fighting for weeks under conditions that would have broken any unit in the world, and who were still in the line, still firing, still refusing to give up. He said that in all his time in the Middle East, fighting the Germans and the Italians, he had never seen anything braver than what those militia boys did at Isurava. And he said that anyone who called them chocolate soldiers after that could answer to him personally. Ralph Honor spent years after the war fighting to ensure that the 39th Battalion received the recognition it deserved. He wrote, he spoke, he lobbied, he argued with anyone who would listen, and many who would not. He called the men of the 39th the bravest he had ever served with, and this was a man who had served with the best the AIF had to offer. He said that history had done them a terrible injustice, and he was determined to put it right. It took decades, but he succeeded. Today, the Isurava Memorial stands on the ridge where those boys fought. It consists of 4 black granite pillars, each bearing a single word: courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. Those 4 words, carved in stone on a ridge in Papua New Guinea, are the final verdict on the Chocos. Not the verdict of the generals, not the verdict of the press, not the verdict of the armchair critics. The verdict of the men who were there. The verdict of the ground itself, soaked in the blood of boys who were told they were not real soldiers, and who proved, in the most terrible way imaginable, that they were the finest soldiers Australia has ever produced. And there is one more detail that deserves to be told, because it strips away every last pretension and leaves nothing but the raw human truth of what happened on that ridge. After the battle, when the survivors of the 39th were finally pulled off the track and assembled at a rest area near Port Moresby, a fresh AIF unit was marching up to take their place. The AIF men were clean, well-fed, fully equipped. They looked at the scarecrows coming down the track, the skeletal figures in rotted uniforms, the hollow eyes, the shaking hands. And some of them began to crack jokes. The usual stuff: Chocos, chocolate soldiers, running rabbits. One of the 39th men stopped. He did not shout. He did not argue. He did not throw a punch. He simply looked at the AIF soldier who had spoken, held his gaze for a long moment, and then kept walking. His mates followed. They did not need to say a word. The look on those faces said everything that needed to be said, and every man in that AIF column who had a functioning conscience knew it. The Chocos did not melt. They were forged. They were forged in the worst conditions the Pacific War could produce, against an enemy that had conquered half of Asia, with equipment that belonged in a museum, under officers who learned their trade in the field because there was no time and no one to teach them. They were forged because they were Australians, and because somewhere in that mix of larrikinism, stubbornness, and bone-deep loyalty to the bloke next to you, there exists a quality that no amount of professional training can manufacture, and no amount of brass-hat condescension can destroy. The generals got their promotions. MacArthur got his headlines. Blamey got his knighthood. But the boys of the 39th Battalion, the ones who survived, got nothing except nightmares, jungle sores that never fully healed, and the knowledge, quiet, private, unspoken, that when the moment came, they had stood firm. Bruce Kingsbury got a Victoria Cross and a grave in Papua New Guinea. The Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels got a poem. Ralph Honor got a lifetime of fighting bureaucrats. And the Kokoda track got 4 granite pillars on a ridge that most Australians will never visit. Courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. 4 words, carved for boys who were told they were not enough. Who proved they were more than enough? Who proved they were everything? The Chocos held the line, and that line held Australia.